Mafia, or rather Cosa Nostra. Many justice collaborators, so-called informants, have described the term mafia as a journalistic invention. It's called Cosa Nostra. This sprawling, far-reaching organization, structured by families and rooted in the territory, has evolved over decades and centuries to reach the present day. Sometimes it has gone through extremely traumatic events. In the 20th century, there were actually two mafia wars. Very long internal settling of scores to define the balance of power, to determine who would be in charge, or, as is the case today, simply to eliminate an extremely troublesome, dangerous, and disruptive element. Today we're talking about the Viale Lazio Massacre, a mafia story dating back to December 10th, 1969. Today we're discussing Michele Cavataio, the mastermind of the first major mafia war in the 1960s. Today we're talking about events, sometimes forgotten by history, even by the news, but that we need to know in order to understand, as often happens, the present. Our story starts in the post-war era, a hard time for all of Italy. Sicily, in particular, finds itself in a state of deep economic, social, and political instability. The end of fascism, the Allied landing in 1943, the difficult return to normality. They had left large power vacuums, especially in urban areas and in the countryside. In this context, the Mafia, Cosa Nostra, which had been weakened years earlier by the tough fight, led by Prefect Mori, began to regain strength, inserting itself into the new balance of power, exploiting poverty, unemployment, and the weakness of the state. In Palermo, building reconstruction in the 1950s and 1960s was a major opportunity for enrichment. There was what came to be called the Sack of Palermo, under the pretense, as the then mayor Vito Ciancimino said, of making the city more beautiful. All they did was destroy part of the architectural heritage to replace it with big apartment buildings where the profits were reinvested. The Sack of Palermo would have turned the city into a huge construction site where building permits, contracts, and real estate speculation would become a battleground between mafia families. And in this context, the rise of Cosa Nostra. This is where the figure of Michele Cavataio emerges, one of the most controversial and destabilizing characters in the history of Italian organized crime. Michele Cavataio, born in Palermo in 1929, grew up in the working-class Acquasanta neighborhood, known for its port and fishing. From a young age, he showed an ambitious and violent character, not suited to discipline. Unlike other top mafia bosses of the time, Cavataio did not come from a historic mafia family, but he managed to assert himself thanks to his strength, cunning, and a remarkable ability to move between crime and business. In the 1950s, Cavataio became the boss of the Acquasanta clan, controlling illegal trafficking, extortion, and especially interests related to construction. Nicknamed Cobra because of his favorite weapon, a Colt Cobra pistol, Cavataio was known for being ruthless and independent, with little respect for the unwritten rules of Cosa Nostra. This made him feared, but also deeply disliked by other bosses. The old guard, those who did not tolerate certain offenses. But what if, between the late 1950s and early 1960s, all of Italy was transformed by the economic boom? Cosa Nostra was also undergoing changes at that time. Along with classic activities like territorial control, intimidation, and protection, new interests emerged. With the Merlin Law, which we already discussed in another video you can find on the channel, the lucrative market of prostitution had opened up, and then came drugs. Drugs, especially heroin, which arrived from Turkey as morphine base, were refined in clandestine laboratories on the outskirts of Palermo and as far as Sinisi. And then the enormous profits from construction, where the bosses reinvested the proceeds from illegal activities. Palermo had become a central hub for these businesses. The mafia families began fiercely competing for control of resources. But to avoid open conflicts, to try to maintain a mafia peace in the conflict, the commission, also known as the cupola, was established, a collegial body that was supposed to resolve disputes between the clans. However, this system of balance was fragile and based on alliances that were not always stable. In this delicate and complex situation, Michele Cavataio was a real loose cannon. He was involved in profitable businesses and always sought more power, often clashing with much stronger families. Those from Ciaculli, Santa Maria di Gesù, and Corleone. At the end of the 1950s, Palermo was divided into spheres of influence. Each family controlled specific areas, but the rapid growth of business made these boundaries increasingly contested. Cavataio, according to several judicial reports, played a leading role in escalating the tensions. Michele Cavataio had several objectives: to eliminate local rivals, to weaken the Mafia Commission that limited his freedom of action, to dismantle it, to take care of it, and to establish himself as a powerful and strong man so he could negotiate as an equal or even at a higher level with all the other bosses. To achieve all this, Cavataio understood that it was necessary to adopt an extremely dangerous strategy, starting with provoking the other families to make them go to war, but striking in such a way that it was never Cavataio himself who was the main one responsible. No, others had to take responsibility, such as the La Barbera family, enough to bring down that complex, very delicate system of balance between the various clans. They all turned against each other, in which he, Cavataio, would emerge as the winner. This strategy became known as the First Great Mafia War, a war that officially began between 1962 and 1963, though its origins trace back earlier. The conflict, as we said, arose from the competition for control of business, especially drug trafficking and the management of construction contracts, in Palermo. One of the episodes that acted as a trigger for this explosive situation was the disappearance and killing of Calcedonio de Pisa. A man of honor connected to the Ciaculli family, he was also involved in drug trafficking, but it ended badly for him. His death is attributed to the Greco family of Ciaculli, a very powerful family, unleashing a spiral of revenge and retaliation. But by digging into the folds of history, the trial documents, and the testimonies, it is discovered that Michele Cavataio played a decisive role in fueling this conflict, striking and misleading, each time finding a different person to blame. This way he weakened the various clans against each other, so that each one looked at the other with suspicion and suspected betrayal. Cavataio, he lacked a powerful clan, often operated in the shadows, used intermediary hitmen, and avoided direct exposure. His goal was chaos, to destabilize the balance, and then present himself as an indispensable player in the new power structure. Several informants, including Antonino Calderoni, and multiple court rulings have identified Cavataio as a main architect of the provocations fueling the war. In particular, he was held responsible for several targeted murders, specifically planned to spark conflict between families that were already tense with each other. This extremely destructive strategy had devastating consequences not only for Cosa Nostra, but for all of Sicily, because the most dramatic moment of the First Mafia War occurred on June 30th, 1963. We are in Ciaculli, a place that gives its name to one of the most powerful families, the Greco family. And right in that area, a car bomb explodes, causing the death of 7 law enforcement officers who responded after an anonymous call. This event marks a historic turning point in the face of the indiscriminate killing of its own servants. The state takes decisive and visible action against the Mafia for the first time. The national public opinion becomes fully aware of the seriousness of the Mafia phenomenon, which until then had often been underestimated or considered a local peripheral problem. The massacre, in reality, was not intended to strike at the state. It was only supposed to be another attempt to blame the Greco family of Ciaculli. Families involved in an increasingly uncontrollable war lost their grip on the situation and found themselves facing the furious reaction of the Italian state. In fact, the government launched a massive crackdown. Hundreds of mafiosi were arrested, and many bosses were forced to go into hiding or to migrate abroad, especially to the Americas. The Parliamentary Anti-Mafia Commission, Giuramento, began to operate more effectively from that moment on. For Cosa Nostra, The Ciaculli incident was a hard blow. The massacre left a long aftermath. That day, June 30th, 1963, the First Mafia War effectively ended with defeat for everyone. Business stopped, families were shattered, and unprecedented state intervention occurred. Still, Cavataio survived the conflict politically. Rumors were already spreading about him, but he survived. This was because there was no solid proof of his guilt, and because the Mafia itself was still too weakened to finish the internal settling of scores. In the following years, despite the trials, convictions, and mandatory stays, Cosa Nostra had tried to rebuild its balance, focusing on greater collegiality and a reduction of internal conflicts, visible ones. Throughout, Cavataio stayed a subtle, troublesome figure, ambitious, independent, and dangerous. Many bosses began to consider him the real person responsible for the war and its consequences. His elimination began to be seen as a necessity to guarantee stability for all of Cosa Nostra. And from here we get to that December day in Milanese on Viale Lazio in Palermo. But wait just a moment longer. Let's try to understand how we get to that massacre after the end of the war, the Mafia War. Cosa Nostra has a fundamental need to rebuild itself from within, to reorganize. Cavataio. There was still an unresolved problem, a problem left behind, but sooner or later it had to be solved. The fact that the boss of Acquasanta kept acting on his own without fully respecting the collective decisions was considered an unacceptable attitude. Moreover, at a time when the Mafia was seeking stability and dignity, according to what emerged in various court documents, it was the cupola, the commission, that made the decision. The elimination of Michele Cavataio was not so much a personal vendetta, but a strategic choice to kill Cavataio, to send a clear message to all of Cosa Nostra, to restore order, to remove the dangerous element that had caused chaos and therefore had to pay for everyone. That's why a joint action with men from various places was chosen. The operation is planned with great care. Cavataio wasn't foolish. He was very cautious, suspicious, and well protected. To get to him, one had to know his habits and skills. He chose the office of a real estate company, an office on Viale Lazio in Palermo, a place that Cavataio frequented for work reasons. Was the target chosen? They moved on to defining the commando. Prominent members coming from well-known Cosa Nostra families. Some of them would become bosses in the following years, showing how the killing of Cavataio was considered an absolute priority within Cosa Nostra. And so we come to the evening of December 10th, 1969. A squad of hitmen, coordinated by Totorina, who stayed in a car to oversee the operation, went to Viale Lazio under Rina's orders. There are Bernardo Provenzano, and with him Calogero Bagarella from the Corleone clan, then Emanuele D'Agostino and Gaetano Grado from the Santa Maria del Gesù clan, and Damiano Caruso from the Riesi clan. Everyone except Rina, who remained in the car, is wearing Guardia di Finanza uniforms. At first, it looks like the classic raid by the Guardia di Finanza in a contractor's office. Girolamo Moncada. In fact, at 108 Viale Lazio in Palermo, Moncada has his offices. Moncada is one of the builders involved in Cosa Nostra's dirty business. As proof, Michele Cavataio has made those offices his own hideout. At first, the raid seems like a classic police operation. The two employees at the office entrance, both of them declare themselves willing to cooperate. But something changes, and it changes quickly. Because at least according to the testimony of one of the informants, Antonino Calderoni Caruso, the most reckless of the group, instead of following the original plan, pulls out his submachine gun and starts shooting. According to another account provided by Grado, it would have been Binu Provenzano, Binu Tratturi, called that because, according to his fellow Mafia members, Wherever he passed, grass would never grow again. It would have been Binu. The first to shoot, they fire with a submachine gun, Beretta Maba 38, with the sawed-off shotgun with pistols. Cavataio hears gunshots, exits the office with his Colt Cobra, and is shot multiple times, collapsing. He appears dead, but is actually seriously wounded. Cavataio, but he doesn't want to give up. Provenzano approaches him, wants to check if the target is dead or not, and kicks him in the leg. Cavataio. At that moment, lying on the ground, he turns and fires a shot at Bagarella's chest, killing him instantly. Then he aims at Provenzano's head. The first shot grazes Bino's throat. Then the gun runs out of ammo. Provenzano tries to kill Cavataio, but the submachine gun jams. So he grabs the Beretta by the grip and starts beating him on the head. In the end, a coup de grace, a shot to the head. The Viale Lazio Massacre is something never seen before, at least in Palermo. They find 5 bodies on the ground, that of Calogero Bagarella, who is abandoned by the rest of the crew, that of the boss Cavataio, and then 3 employees. The company was owned by Francesco Tuminello, a convicted criminal, Cavataio's partner and right-hand man, and caretaker for Girolamo Moncada, Salvatore Bevidacqua, and Giovanni Domè. Those 2 raised their hands before the squad disguised as finance police. The sons of the builder Girolamo Moncada were also injured, even though they were basically uninvolved in the events. The massacre on Viale LA has a deep meaning. Above all, it shows that the Mafia had once again become an organization capable of acting in a unified, cohesive way, striking internally. It revealed the most modern, ruthless side of Cosa Nostra, focused on collective decisions and a managerial approach to criminal power. After the massacre, the situation in Palermo stabilized fairly quickly, but not definitively. For some time, the Mafia families avoided open conflicts and focused on business, keeping a lower profile. An apparent calm that would be broken just over 10 years later with the Second Great Mafia War of Milan. But before we conclude, we have to ask ourselves, what role did Michele Cavataio play within Cosa Nostra? At least from a historical perspective, he was a destabilizer, but not the most powerful or richest boss. And yet, with his tactics, with his ability to destabilize, with his hit-and-run methods, with his skill in shifting blame, he was able to bring out all the internal contradictions of the organization. Cavataio was a central figure in the transition from a still traditional, rural mafia to the modern mafia, focused on business and systematic control of the urban territory, Cavataio. However, he had an individualistic, aggressive approach, something that could not stand alone against the enormous, especially collective, strength of Cosa Nostra. From a mafia point of view, Cavataio paid the price for having crossed the unwritten, but very real limits of the organization. Historically, his story shows the Mafia has never been a monolithic entity, but a system that is sometimes united, sometimes divided, marked by divergent interests, power struggles, and sometimes open conflicts. The first Mafia war was not isolated, but marked a decisive turning point, obviously because of the state's reaction and the awareness raised among the national public opinion. The Ciaculli massacre has remained in the history books. The Viale Lazio Massacre is one of the most iconic events in Italian mafia history. The internal massacre, with a profound meaning, had shown that the mafia was capable of self-regulating with extreme harshness, without waiting for the intervention of the state. For the Italian Republic itself, the Viale Lazio Massacre was a further sign of the complexity. It was not just a matter of ordinary crime, but of a deeply rooted system of power, capable of making strategic decisions and profoundly influencing social and economic life, first in Sicily and then throughout the whole country. The legacy of the First Mafia War and the Viale Lazio Massacre is still being studied today. These events help to understand the internal dynamics of criminal organizations and the risks associated with underestimating the mafia phenomenon. The Il Cobra shows how the systematic use of violence, even within the same criminal organizations, ends up producing instability and chain reactions that are difficult to control. It's a lesson that goes far beyond the Sicilian context and more generally concerns the relationship between organized crime, political power, and society. These events tell not only of the brutality of Cosa Nostra, but also of its astonishing ability to adapt and transform, like a chameleon that changes the color of its skin but always remains the same. Studying these events means better understanding the roots of the contemporary mafia and recognizing the importance of a strong institutional and cultural response, capable of countering not only the violence, but also the support that grows, and the interests that allow organized crime to survive. To see how Cosa Nostra, the mafia, organized crime, is able to self-regulate and punish its own members. Tosi makes us understand that the state's fight against organized crime really never ends. Because the Viale Lazio Massacre gives another lesson, it sends a message outside the mafia world. It sends a message to society. If a mafioso has treated you badly and you are protected by the mafia, don't turn to the state. The mafia itself will take care of it, settle its own unfinished business, and give you justice. And this is the worst message because it conveys a sense of insecurity or a lack of trust from the citizen towards the state. It should protect the citizen, but instead pushes him toward Cosa Nostra as the only truly solid resource, truly centuries old, truly capable of intervening in every part of our society. And this, believe me, is the worst message of all. It means distrust in the state, distrust in the community, distrust in everything we are.